Clint Eastwood told a young actor, "You'll never make it," and fired him from Unforgiven. What happened 10 years later on the Oscar stage destroyed Clint completely. It was March 24th, 2002, at the Kodak Theater in Los Angeles. The 74th Academy Awards were reaching their climax, and backstage in the wings, Clint Eastwood stood watching a monitor as the Best Actor category was about to be announced. He wasn't nominated that year, wasn't presenting, wasn't there in any official capacity. He was simply attending as a guest, watching the ceremony unfold like everyone else. When the envelope was opened and a name was called, Clint's face went white. The cameras backstage caught something remarkable in that moment. One of Hollywood's toughest legends suddenly looked like he'd been punched in the stomach. Within seconds, tears were streaming down his face, and he had to grip the wall to steady himself. The name that had just been called was Michael Sterling, a 38-year-old actor who'd been nominated for his devastating performance in a small independent film about addiction and redemption. As Sterling walked to the stage to accept his Oscar, Clint Eastwood stood backstage, crying in a way that shocked everyone who saw it. Because Clint knew something nobody else in that theater knew. 10 years earlier, on the set of Unforgiven, he had destroyed that man's career with 4 words. To understand what happened that night at the Oscars, you have to go back to August 1992 to a dusty location in Alberta, Canada, where Clint was directing and starring in what would become his masterpiece, Unforgiven. Michael Sterling was 28 years old, and landing a role in a Clint Eastwood film felt like winning the lottery. It wasn't a big part. He was playing one of the deputies working for Gene Hackman's brutal sheriff character. But it was a speaking role in what was clearly going to be an important film. Michael had been grinding away in theater and tiny television roles for 6 years. This was supposed to be his breakthrough. The first week of shooting went well. Michael showed up early, knew his lines, hit his marks. He was professional, eager, maybe a little too eager. He'd grown up watching Clint Eastwood movies, idolizing the man, and now he was actually working with him. He wanted to impress him so badly that he started asking questions. Lots of questions. "Mr. Eastwood, for this scene, should my character be more aggressive or more calculating?" "Clint, I was thinking about my character's backstory. What if he had military experience? Would that change how I noticed in the script there's a moment where I could..." At first, Clint tolerated it. He'd nod, give brief answers, redirect Michael back to the script. But as the days went on, Michael's insecurity manifested as constant questioning, constant suggestions, constant attempts to expand his small role into something bigger. He wasn't being malicious, he was just terrified of failing and desperately trying to prove he belonged there. On the 9th day of shooting, they were filming a scene in the town's main street. It was a crucial sequence, and Clint was behind the camera directing while also preparing to step in front of it for his own coverage. The scene required precision timing with multiple actors, specific lighting conditions, and they were losing daylight fast. Michael, in costume and ready for his bit part in the scene, approached Clint during a lighting setup. He had an idea about how his character might react differently in the scene, and he wanted to discuss it before they shot. "Clint, I was thinking..." "Not now," Clint said, his attention on the camera setup. "I know, but it's just that if my character..." "Michael, I said not now. But it would only take a second to..." That's when it happened. Clint stepped away from the camera, walked directly up to Michael, and with the cold, measured tone that had terrified villains in dozens of westerns, he said, "You talk too much, you think too much, and you'll never make it." The set went silent. 40 crew members and actors suddenly found other places to look. Michael stood there, feeling like he'd been slapped. "Pack your things," Clint continued, his voice never rising above a conversational level, which somehow made it worse. "You're done." "Clint, you're fired. Get off my set." Michael Sterling stood there for 5 seconds that felt like 5 hours, then walked to his trailer, packed his belongings, and drove away from the biggest opportunity of his life. He didn't cry until he was 30 miles down the highway. Then he had to pull over because he was sobbing so hard he couldn't see the road. The firing sent shockwaves through Hollywood's small actor community. Word got around fast. Michael Sterling had been fired by Clint Eastwood from Unforgiven. The reasons varied depending on who was telling the story. Some said he was unprofessional. Others said he couldn't handle the role. A few said he'd argued with Clint. Nobody knew the real story, but it didn't matter. In Hollywood, being fired by a legend like Clint Eastwood was a mark that didn't wash off. Michael's agent dropped him within a week. "I can't sell an actor that Clint Eastwood fired," she said apologetically. "It's nothing personal." For the next 3 years, Michael couldn't get an audition for anything significant. The roles he'd been up for before Unforgiven suddenly went to other actors. Casting directors who'd been interested in him stopped returning calls. He was blacklisted, not officially, but functionally. Because if Clint Eastwood thought you'd never make it, why would anyone else take a chance on you? Michael moved back to Chicago and started doing theater again, not because he wanted to, but because it was the only work he could get. He performed in tiny black box theaters for audiences of 30 people. He waited tables between shows. He watched Unforgiven win 4 Academy Awards in 1993, including Best Picture and Best Director for Clint, and he felt like he was watching his own funeral. But something happened during those dark years. The rejection, the humiliation, the absolute certainty that his career was over. It burned away everything superficial in Michael's approach to acting. He stopped trying to impress people. He stopped asking questions to sound smart. He stopped trying to expand his roles or make himself more visible. He just focused on the truth of each character, each moment. In small Chicago theaters, performing for handfuls of people who paid $10 for tickets, Michael Sterling became one of the most compelling actors working in American theater. Critics from the Chicago Tribune and Reader started attending his shows. Word spread. A film producer from New York saw him perform in a production of Death of a Salesman and offered him the lead in a low-budget independent film about a recovering addict trying to rebuild his relationship with his daughter. The film, called Second Chances, was shot for $800,000 over 18 days. Nobody expected it to go anywhere. But when it premiered at Sundance in January 2002, something magical happened. Audiences stayed in their seats after the credits rolled, too emotionally devastated to move. Critics used words like transformative and gutting. Michael's performance was described as one of the most honest, vulnerable, and powerful pieces of screen acting in years. By March, Michael Sterling had received nominations from every major film organization, including the Academy Awards. He was the underdog story of that year's Oscar race, the unknown theater actor who'd created something undeniable in a tiny independent film that most people hadn't even heard of until award season. Clint Eastwood had seen the film. In late February 2002, a friend had recommended it, mentioning there was an actor Clint might find interesting in it. Clint watched it alone in his home screening room, and about 20 minutes in, he realized with growing horror that he was watching Michael Sterling, the young actor he'd destroyed 10 years earlier. The performance was extraordinary. Michael had become exactly the kind of actor Clint respected most. Honest, minimal, powerful. Every choice was truthful. There was no showing off, no actor tricks, just pure emotional reality. Clint sat in his screening room after the film ended, staring at the credits as Michael's name appeared, and he felt something he rarely allowed himself to feel. Shame. He'd been wrong. Completely, devastatingly wrong. This actor hadn't just made it, he'd become something special, and Clint had almost prevented it from happening. On Oscar night, Clint attended the ceremony with a sense of dread. He hoped Michael wouldn't win, not because he didn't deserve it, but because Clint didn't want to face the public reminder of his own cruelty. But when Michael's name was called and the underdog actually won, Clint felt his legs go weak. From backstage, Clint watched on a monitor as Michael Sterling walked to the stage, accepted his Oscar, and stood at the microphone looking genuinely overwhelmed. The speech started conventionally enough, thanking the director, the producers, his family, his theater community in Chicago. Then, Michael said something that changed everything. I also need to thank someone who probably doesn't even remember me," Michael said, his voice steady but loaded with meaning. 10 years ago, I worked for one day on a Clint Eastwood film. At the end of that day, Clint told me I'd never make it. And you know what? He was right. The audience went quiet, confused. Clint backstage felt like he'd stopped breathing. The person I was back then, insecure, desperate, performing instead of being, that person never would have made it. That person deserved to be fired. And being fired, being told I wasn't good enough, was the most important thing that ever happened to me. It forced me to stop performing my life and start living it. It forced me to find truth instead of approval. So Clint, wherever you are tonight, thank you. You broke me. And breaking me was exactly what I needed. Michael held up his Oscar. This belongs to the man I became after you destroyed who I was. Thank you. The audience applauded, seeing it as a gracious acknowledgement of a harsh but effective lesson. They didn't understand what Clint understood. This wasn't forgiveness. This was something far more complex. Michael was thanking Clint for accidentally giving him the greatest gift of his life. But there was an edge to it, a recognition that the gift came from cruelty, not wisdom. Backstage, Clint Eastwood collapsed against a wall, tears streaming down his face. A production assistant rushed over, asking if he needed medical attention. Clint waved him away, unable to speak. Because in that moment, Clint remembered something he'd spent 40 years trying to forget. In 1959, Clint Eastwood was a struggling actor in his late 20s, doing bit parts in B-movies and television shows. He'd gotten a small role in a Western being, directed by a prominent director of the era named William Whitney. Clint was excited, maybe too excited. He kept trying to expand his role, asking questions, making suggestions. He thought he was showing enthusiasm and dedication. On the third day of shooting, Whitney pulled him aside and said, "Kid, you talk too much, you think too much, and you'll never make it in this business. You're fired." Those words had haunted Clint for years. They'd made him doubt himself, made him question whether he should give up acting entirely. They'd also made him ruthlessly self-critical, determined to prove Whitney wrong through pure discipline and minimalism. In a twisted way, that firing had shaped everything Clint became. And now, standing backstage at the Oscars watching Michael Sterling hold his Oscar, Clint realized with devastating clarity that he'd become William Whitney. He'd taken the cruelty that had been inflicted on him and passed it on to someone else. He'd used the exact same words that had been used to destroy him, and he'd destroyed someone else with them. The difference was that Michael had framed it as a gift. He'd taken the cruelty and transformed it into fuel. He'd found a way to make meaning out of being broken. But that didn't change what Clint had done. It didn't erase the fact that he'd become the villain in someone else's origin story. Clint left the Oscars that night without speaking to anyone. He drove home alone, went to his study, and did something he'd never done before. He wrote a letter to Michael Sterling. He didn't mail it. He just needed to write it, to confess, to acknowledge what he'd done. The letter said, "You were right. I broke you, but I didn't do it to help you. I did it because you reminded me of who I used to be, and I hated that person. I destroyed you because destroying you felt like destroying the weakness I'd spent my life running from. You made something beautiful from that cruelty, but that doesn't make the cruelty less cruel. I became the person I hated most, and I'll have to live with that." He never sent the letter, but he kept it in his desk drawer, and according to people close to Clint, he reads it sometimes when he's making decisions about how to treat people on his sets. 3 years after that Oscar night in 2005, Clint was directing $1 Million Baby. There was a young actress in a small role who kept asking questions, making suggestions, trying to expand her part. The crew tensed, remembering stories about actors who'd been fired by Clint for similar behavior. But this time, Clint did something different. He pulled the actress aside privately, and instead of firing her, he sat down with her for 20 minutes. He talked to her about insecurity, about the difference between performing and being, about how sometimes less is more. He was kind, he was patient. He was the mentor he wished he'd had instead of William Whitney, the mentor he wished he'd been for Michael Sterling. The actress later said that conversation changed her approach to acting and became one of the most important moments of her career. Michael Sterling went on to have a distinguished career in film, television, and theater. He never worked with Clint Eastwood again, and when asked about him in interviews, Michael always repeated the same story he'd told at the Oscars, that being fired was the best thing that ever happened to him. But people close to Michael say, that's not entirely true. He does credit that moment with forcing him to transform, but he also carries the wound of it. He remembers driving down that highway in 1992, crying so hard he couldn't breathe, believing his life was over. He remembers the 3 years of rejection that followed. He remembers what it felt like to be told by a legend that you'd never make it. Michael made it beautiful in the retelling. He made it meaningful. But that doesn't mean it didn't hurt, and that doesn't mean Clint was right to do it. The story of Clint Eastwood and Michael Sterling is ultimately a story about how we pass on our wounds. Clint had been fired cruelly as a young man, and instead of vowing never to do that to someone else, he did exactly that, using the same words, inflicting the same wound. He repeated the cycle because unexamined pain has a way of replicating itself. Michael broke the cycle by transforming his pain into art, into purpose. He took what was meant to destroy him and used it as raw material for becoming something better. That's not because being destroyed was good. It's because Michael refused to let destruction be the end of his story. And Clint, to his credit, eventually learned. He learned that breaking people isn't the same as teaching them. He learned that cruelty, even effective cruelty, is still cruelty. He learned that becoming a legend doesn't mean you have the right to destroy the people who remind you of who you used to be. Today, that Oscar sits on Michael Sterling's shelf. Next to it is a playbill from one of those tiny Chicago theater productions where he performed for 30 people and learned how to be truthful. He keeps both items together as a reminder. The height of success and the depth of rejection are both part of the same story. Neither cancels out the other. Both are real. Both matter. And somewhere in Clint Eastwood's study is an unsent letter, a confession written backstage at the Oscars, a reminder that the person you become is sometimes the person you swore you'd never be. And recognizing that is the first step toward becoming someone else. If this story of cycles, wounds, and transformation moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs to understand that sometimes the cruelty we inflict is just the cruelty that was inflicted on us. And breaking that cycle means choosing to be different than the people who broke us. Have you ever realized you'd become the person you hated? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to ring that notification bell for more powerful true stories about Hollywood's hidden moments of self-recognition.